Get ready for a survival journey like you have never seen before. Deep in the ruthless wilds of one of Canada's most dangerous forests, Claire Dubois, a woman scarred by pain and powered by courage, faces the fiercest battle of her life, surviving a brutal attack from a massive grizzly bear. Blood, fear, hope, and strength weave together in a story where every single breath could be the last. You will feel the cold of the forest, the panic of being hunted, and the incredible willpower that turns a victim into a true survivor. Do not miss a single moment of this tense and emotional story. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to experience the most intense and emotional stories with us. Now take a deep breath. The forest is waiting for you. The wind sliced through the gray sky like invisible blades, bending the tops of the pine trees as if the forest itself was breathing, slow and threatening. Claire Dubois adjusted the strap of her backpack and took a deep breath, letting the cold air, rich with the scent of wet earth, fill her lungs. She paused at the edge of the trail, staring into the vast, dark green stretch ahead of her. Caribou Ridge Forest, one of the wildest, most untouched places in all of Canada. It's just a hike, she whispered to herself, like someone who needed to hear the lie to believe it. But Claire knew it wasn't just a hike. She was here for a reason. To run from the memories, from the wreckage of a failed marriage, from the pain that followed her even into her dreams. Maybe she thought in the deep silence of the forest, she'd find some kind of answer, or at least a little piece. A little piece. That Claire's little piece, the little piece, the ground beneath her feet sank slightly with moss and dead leaves. Every step echoed like a muffled cry between the trees. As she walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization vanished. No more cars, no voices, not even a cell signal. Just the soft rustle of branches in the wind, and every now and then, a sharp crack from somewhere unseen. Claire quickened her pace, her heart beating faster for no clear reason. Or was there a reason? That's when she saw them large footprints much bigger than a wolf's or a moose's, pressed deep into the muddy trail a few feet ahead. The earth looked torn by the claws of something heavy, very heavy. She crouched down and ran her fingers over the marks. There, she whispered, a chill running down her spine. The old radio in her backpack crackled just once like a whispered warning, then went completely silent. Claire looked around, that unmistakable feeling settling in. She was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around her, forming living walls. Somewhere off in the distance, a crow let out a harsh caw like it was declaring a verdict. The forest, once beautiful, now felt like a maze of shadows and invisible eyes. She pulled her jacket tighter, tried to ignore the rising fear, and kept walking, forcing herself to keep her breathing steady. But the forest seemed to have plans of its own for her. With every step, the forest felt denser, more alive, as if it were pulsing with a rhythm Claire couldn't quite follow. She had been walking for just over 2 hours, but something inside her was already screaming to turn back. Instinct, that old, primal whisper, was hissing in her ears. You're not welcome here. She stopped abruptly. A squirrel that had been watching her darted frantically into the underbrush, like it was running from something far worse than a human. Further ahead, the chirping of birds suddenly cut off, like a symphony sliced in half. Claire clenched her fist, the weight of her backpack growing heavier with each second. It's nothing, Claire. You saw tracks, that's all. Old tracks, maybe a wolf. A big moose, she tried to reason with herself, but even her own voice sounded fake. Shaky. She looked around, black, twisted trees and shadows that seemed to shift whenever she wasn't looking directly at them. The air was colder now, damp, thick, like breathing inside a nightmare. She knew she should have stayed closer to the main trail, but she'd chosen to take a shortcut, following the path of a dried-up river that had looked promising on the crumpled map she carried. Shortcut, she had thought. She had thought. The sludgy, the silt, the vere. Say cheer to closer to the main trail. But she'd had short ki shared in si take shazen she. To take the chase cheer. Shortcut. Saves time. Now, lost among twin trunks and thick brush, Claire felt like every wrong decision was stacking up like stones on her own grave. Another sound broke the silence, a branch snapping. Loud. Deliberate. She spun around fast, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Nothing. Just the forest. But she knew. Something was there. Something big, with trembling hands. She reached for the knife strapped to the side of her backpack. It wasn't much a small camping knife, nearly useless against whatever was out there, but the cold steel in her grip gave her a fleeting sense of control. Focus, Claire, focus, she whispered to herself. She moved faster, trying to ignore the crawling sensation that crept along her back like phantom fingers. Every bush seemed to hide eyes. Every shadow looked like it might reach out and grab her. She didn't know it yet, but the real horror was just about to show itself. And there, in that moment, with no one around to witness it, the forest whispered a warning she didn't understand, until it was too late. Claire stumbled over thick roots and rocks hidden beneath the moss, her body wound tight like a ship's rigging in a storm. With every step, the silence around her grew heavier, more absolute, like even the wind was holding its breath, waiting, and then she saw it. At first, it was just movement, a shadow far too large, sliding between the trees, slow and heavy. Claire froze, a cold sweat trickling down her spine. She squinted, trying to see more clearly, but her mind shock took precious seconds to register what her eyes already knew. A massive grizzly bear, its fur soaked from the recent rain, stood watching her. Its black eyes looked like endless voids locked on her. The world shrank until only the two of them existed. The bear stepped forward. The ground shook under its weight. Claire wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but her body wouldn't move. She was frozen, locked in that old, primal reaction humans have when staring death in the face. Don't make sudden movements. Don't run. Don't. Make yourself look big. Double. Wrote the tips she'd read before the trip echoed uselessly in her head like scraps of a forgotten prayer. The bear huffed, sending a cloud of vapor into the freezing air. Then, with a deep guttural growl that seemed to rise straight from the earth itself, it charged. Claire reacted in the last second. She tossed her backpack to the ground in a desperate attempt to distract the bear and sprinted to the opposite side, her heart pounding so hard she could feel the thumping in her ears. But the bear, whether hungry or just territorial, wasn't fooled. The sound of heavy steps, breaking branches and crushing vegetation, grew closer with every beat of her heart. A brutal strike to her back sent her sprawling forward. She hit the ground hard, her face scraping against the stone-filled earth. The growl came right after a roar so deafening it felt like it tore the air apart. Without thinking, Claire rolled to the side. The bear's paw came down violently, smashing the ground where she had been just seconds before. Dirt and leaves flew. She scrambled to her feet, staggering, her body protesting in pain. The bear attacked again. She instinctively raised her arm to shield herself. The claw ripped through her jacket and slashed a deep gash into her forearm. Hot blood poured out almost instantly, dripping into the mud. Screaming in pain and terror, Claire drove the small knife into the bear's snout. It wasn't a fatal blow, but the bear recoiled for a moment, more shaken by the surprise than the pain. That moment of hesitation was all she needed. She ran, stumbling, her whole body aching. She knew she couldn't keep up that pace for much longer. The bear, behind her, roared, moving with an unnatural speed for something so massive. The world became a blur of greens and browns. Branches whipped across her face, scratching her already bloodied skin. Every breath felt like a knife in her lungs. Every beat of her heart seemed to announce her presence even more to the predator. She slid down a muddy slope, tumbling awkwardly until she stopped between moss-covered rocks. The bear came crashing down after her, slipping too, but never losing its fury, never losing the trail. With her injured arm throbbing and the knife now lost somewhere in the fall, Claire knew she was on the edge of exhaustion, and the real fight for survival was just beginning. There, lost and wounded in the heart of a forest that didn't forgive mistakes, Claire understood. There was no more room for hesitation. Either she survived, or she became just another forgotten echo between the trees. Claire stumbled to her feet, her knees shaking under the weight of adrenaline and pain. Blood was pouring from the gash in her arm, and her torn jacket clung to her sweat and dirt-soaked skin. She could barely think, only act, driven by a survival instinct as raw as the predator chasing her. The bear roared behind her, just a few yards away, its voice vibrating through the trees like a personal thunderclap. Every snap of a broken branch sounded like a gunshot in the deadly silence of the forest. Claire hurled herself forward, ignoring the screaming protests of her muscles, every breath ripped from her burning lungs. She ran between tightly packed trunks, leaping over exposed roots, scratching herself on bush that clawed at her like invisible hands. The uneven ground threatened to take her down at every step, but stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant dying. Ahead, she spotted a narrow creek winding through the trees like a silver ribbon. Without thinking, she veered toward the water, stumbling and nearly falling as she crossed the slick stones. The sound of rushing water briefly masked the monster's pursuit, but Claire's pounding heart knew he was still after her. At the far bank, she dropped to her knees, her body giving in to exhaustion. She glanced over her shoulder. It's over her shoulder. Through the thin mist rising from the cold ground, she saw it, the massive shadow of the bear emerging, its wild eyes locked onto her with primal determination. No, I'm not dying here, she gasped through clenched teeth, each word a challenge hurled against fate itself. Forcing herself back to her feet, Claire pushed deeper into the forest. She had to break the line of sight. Its wild eyes locked onto her with primal determination. No, I'm not dying here, she gasped through clenched teeth. Claire adjusted itself, forcing herself back to her feet. Claire distance. She had to create distance. She remembered something she had read. Despite their brute strength, bears could sometimes be tricked, crossing water, masking scent with mud, zigzagging to confuse their path. Each thought flickered like a spark in a mind almost consumed by fear. She burst into a clearing, half lit by the gray twilight. The ground there was a treacherous mix of moss and mud. Her feet sank in, and she fell hard onto her side, her already battered shoulders screaming in agony. Behind her, the bear emerged from the brush like a living shadow. Claire dragged herself forward, her hands clawing at the wet earth, and threw herself against a fallen tree. Using the trunk as makeshift cover, she gasped for breath, forcing her exhausted body to obey. The bear sniffed the air. A low, threatening rumble built in its throat, like it was savoring how close its prey was. Claire shut her eyes for a second, feeling tears mix with the mud on her face. If I stop moving, if I give in to fear, he'll kill me. The urge to give up was overwhelming, but another force, deeper, stirred inside her. A fleeting memory from childhood, running wild through open fields, her father teaching her how to survive in the wild, laughing as he said, "Never turn your back on life, Claire, never." With a primal scream, she pushed herself up and sprinted sideways, out of the clearing and back into the thick woods. The bear roared in fury just a few yards behind. Now the chase was blind, brutal, desperate. Claire had no idea where she was running. She only knew she had to keep moving, had to outrun the forest, the fear, the pain itself. Every heartbeat was a cruel countdown. Every step was a direct challenge to death. The sound of the bear grew fainter. Or was she just delirious? In a sudden twist of luck or providence, she spotted a rocky formation, a narrow gap between two massive, moss-covered boulders. Without hesitation, she squeezed herself into the crack, her shoulders scraping against the rough stone, her chest screaming in pain as she compressed her lungs. Inside the cramped, dark space, Claire could barely move. All she could do was listen. The bear, furious now, stormed, Through the woods, heavy steps crushed the underbrush all around. The rustling of the trees seemed to mock her, betraying her presence. But, miraculously, the bear didn't find her. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Claire huddled between the rocks, her face streaked with blood, dirt, and tears, shivered not just from the cold but from the terrifying realization. She was alive, for now, and the forest, endless and silent, kept its watch like it knew the real test was only just beginning. Time seemed to melt away into the damp darkness of the rocky crevice where Claire hid. Every second was a battle between the desperate urge to stay still and the vital need to act. The metallic smell of her own blood filled her nose, mixing with the scent of wet earth and old moss. She knew she couldn't stay there forever. With cautious, painful movements, she dragged herself out of her makeshift shelter, her muscles stiff and sore as if carrying the weight of death itself. Above the trees, the sky had already faded into a grim gray night was falling fast, and with it, a cold that promised to be just as lethal as any predator. Claire needed to take care of her wounds, immediately. Feeling around in her backpack, she found the small first aid kit she had packed like a lucky charm before the trip. Her trembling hands struggled to open the zipper. The deep gash on her arm throbbed with every movement. She pulled out a bandage and, using her teeth, tore the fabric, improvising a tight wrap to slow the bleeding. Touching the wound filled her eyes with tears, but she refused to cry. Not anymore. Tears had no value here. She applied some antiseptic, the burn exploding like fire across her torn skin. She clenched her tooth to keep from screaming. "You have to be stronger than the pain," she thought, hearing the echo of her father's voice again in her mind. With her arm poorly bandaged, Claire tried to reorient herself. She needed shelter someplace that could hide her not just from the bear, but from the merciless night closing in. The ground was cold and slick beneath her soaked boots. Every step was a negotiation between courage and exhaustion. She walked in silence, hearing only her own ragged breathing and the threatening whispers of the trees. From time to time, she stopped to scan the darkness, her senses razor-sharp, searching for any sign of danger. Along the way, she spotted a small rise in the terrain, a rocky outcropping, half covered in ferns and moss. Perfect. With effort, she climbed up and tucked herself into a hollow protected by thick, twisted roots there, shielded from the cutting wind. She started working on the only thing that might save her: camouflage and improvised traps. She gathered branches, leaves, and moss, covering herself as best she could to mask her scent and presence. The cold bit into her bones, but she kept moving, every action a small act of defiance. From her pocket, she pulled out a small pocket knife, the only weapon she had left in starting up rough traps. Makeshift snares with vines, sharpened stakes hidden under leaves. She knew that if the bear came back, it wouldn't be enough to kill it. But maybe, just maybe, it would buy her some time. Her world had shrunk down to that tiny patch of earth and darkness. As she worked, memories began to break through, as if the forest itself was pulling secrets from her mind. She remembered the day she decided to take this journey, the look on her mother's face, her voice thick with emotion. "Find what you've lost, Claire. But don't lose yourself along the way." Now, here, with death brushing at her heels, Claire finally understood. This forest wasn't just a place, it was a trial, a brutal mirror of her own weaknesses and strengths. Time crawled by. Night fell like a living curtain, filled with sounds that tested her sanity. Claire felt sleep pressing down on her, but she knew surrendering to it would be dangerous. She fought the exhaustion, keeping her ears sharp for any sound that might betray the bear's return. At one point, a crack in the distance froze her blood. The bear? Or just the forest playing tricks on her mind? Claire pressed herself tighter against the cold rock, feeling each heartbeat drum like ancient ritual drums inside her chest. She would not surrender, not yet. As long as there was, in her lungs, and fire in her eyes, she would fight. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about reclaiming her life. And in the dawn that would come, Claire knew the forest would test just how far she was willing to go for it. The cold before dawn felt like a living thing, creeping through Claire's torn clothes, sinking deep into her bones. She stayed curled up in the crevice between the rocks, eyes heavy, her body wrecked by pain and exhaustion. Time dragged by, broken into strange fragments of half-sleep and brief, watchful moments, moments where the forest seemed to whisper ancient secrets. When the first pale light of dawn touched the highest treetops, Claire knew she had to move. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about overcoming. With great effort, she stood. Her wounded arm throbbed, the makeshift bandage now soaked in dried blood. Every movement felt like it pulled strands of energy out of what little she had left. Still, something had changed inside her, something quiet, but solid. A resolve. Claire knew she couldn't keep running. The forest didn't forgive weakness. If she wanted to survive, she'd have to become part of it. Climbing down from the rocks, moving like a silent shadow between the trees, Claire searched for anything that could give her an advantage. Her eyes scanned the ground, fallen branches, sharp stones, faint animal tracks. It felt like the night had stripped her bare, and now she was one with the forest. Then she saw it, a cabin. Old and nearly swallowed by the undergrowth, it was tucked into a small depression in the land. Its wooden walls were covered in moss, the roof partially caved in, but it was real, it was shelter, a flicker of hope. Claire approached, slowly, every step careful, her heart pounding. She pushed the rotting door open with her shoulder. The inside smelled of mold and long abandonment. A shattered window let in soft shafts of light, revealing broken-down furniture and rusted tools scattered across the floor. She closed the door behind her and dragged a fallen beam across it like a makeshift lock. Then, just for a moment, she leaned against the wall and allowed herself a real breath. It hurt, but within that pain, a small ember of hope sparked. Revealing that pain, a small ember sparked. She knew it wouldn't be safe for long. The bear could still find her. With a renewed sense of purpose, Claire began to search the cabin. She found pieces of rotting rope, an old axe with a cracked handle, shards of broken glass bottles. Each object became part of a crude plan forming in her mind, primitive and urgent, like survival itself. She worked quickly, no time to hesitate. With a renewed sense of purpose, Claire began to search the cabin. She found pieces of rotting rope, an old axe with a cracked handle. Each object became part of a crude plan forming in her mind, primitive and urgent, like survival itself. She began building makeshift traps, ropes tied across the doorway, shards of glass hidden beneath dry leaves, sharpened stakes driven into likely paths. She used what little she knew, and a whole lot of instinct. The sun had barely risen when she heard it again. Heavy footsteps. The forest tearing under the relentless approach of the bear. There was no time for fear, no time for doubt. Claire grabbed the rusted axe, feeling the cold weight of it in her hands. She took position behind the entrance, every heartbeat pounding like a war drum in her chest. The bear emerged into the small clearing, a colossus of muscle and raw wildness. It stopped, sniffing the air, its small, cunning eyes locking onto the cabin. Claire held her breath, every fiber of her body humming with tension. The bear moved forward, heavy and relentless, snapping branches like they were twigs, its claws raked against the wood of the door. A powerful strike split the door in two. Claire waited. She couldn't strike too soon. The bear pushed its massive body inside, first a paw, then its enormous snout, sniffing out danger but not yet understanding it. The instant its paw caught in the improvised trap of ropes and glass shards, Claire moved. In one desperate but precise motion, she raised the axe and swung it with all her strength, landing a brutal blow across the bear's snout. The roar that followed was deafening. The bear stumbled back, disoriented by the pain and rage. It tried to charge again, but its paws crushed down onto the hidden glass shards beneath the dry leaves, cutting deep and throwing it off balance. Claire didn't hesitate. She swung again, this time aiming for its eyes with every ounce of strength she had left. The bear staggered, letting out a deep, guttural growl, and then, in one confused, clumsy movement, it retreated. It backed out of the cabin, disappearing into the trees. Claire collapsed onto the floor, the axe slipping from her blood and mud-covered hands. For long minutes, all she could do was breathe, feeling her whole body tremble from adrenaline and exhaustion. She didn't know if the bear would come back. She didn't know if she could survive another attack, but right now she knew one thing. She had turned the tide. For the first time since stepping into that cursed forest, Claire was no longer the helpless prey. She was the survivor. The sun rose slowly in the sky, casting pale rays through the trees like golden spears piercing the mist still crawling across the forest floor. Claire remained motionless on the cabin floor, her body stiff with exhaustion, her mind drifting between consciousness and delirium. The axe was still nearby, but her arms trembled so badly that even lifting it seemed impossible. She knew she couldn't stay there. The bear might return, driven by fury or hunger, and in her condition, she wouldn't survive another attack. She had to leave. She had to find help. Summoning strength she didn't know she still had, Claire pushed herself up, leaning against the rotting wooden wall. Every movement brought a fresh wave of pain, a cruel reminder of the night before. The gash in her arm was inflamed, throbbing with the first signs of fever. Her legs ached so deeply she wondered if they'd carry her much farther. And still she walked. She left the cabin behind, moving through the forest like a wounded shadow, the world spinning gently around her. Each step was a small miracle. Each meter gained, a victory over despair. The morning silence felt thick, almost reverent, as if the forest itself acknowledged the weight of her journey. Claire moved with no clear direction, simply following the downward slope of the land, hoping to find a river, a road, any sign of the world beyond the trees. Hours dragged by. Hunger was a hollow, gnawing pain in her stomach. Thirst burned her throat like sandpaper. At times, she stopped to lean against trees, her eyes closing for seconds that felt like lifetimes. And every time the thought of giving up crept in, she saw flashes, her mother's laugh, her father's gentle smile, moments of life that felt like they belonged to another existence, yet pulled her forward all the same. Then she heard it, the sound of water faint distant like music drifting through the woods. She forced herself to follow it, stumbling, falling to her knees in the mud but never stopping. When the river finally came into view, wide and calm, cutting through the forest like a living road, a sob escaped her cracked lips. Claire drank greedily, the icy water a momentary blessing to her battered body. And then, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. An engine, low, distant, but real. Claire lifted her head, her heart pounding with a hope so fierce it hurt. It's not my imagination. Not this time. She staggered along the riverbank, the sound growing louder, becoming the unmistakable hum of a boat engine. With the last of her strength, Claire tore a strip from her filthy shirt and tied it to a broken branch. Waving the makeshift flag in the air like a signal of survival, she cried out with a broken, raspy voice, "Here! Over here! Please! The boat came!" Around the bend, small, manned by two men in orange vests, rescue scouts. Claire saw the moment they spotted her. She saw the shock on their faces, the rushed gestures as they steered the boat toward her. She dropped to her knees, too weak to stand. And then the tears came, not from pain, not from fear, but from sheer, overwhelming relief. The rescuers jumped onto the riverbank, running to her. English and French words swirled around her in a flurry of commands and concerned voices. "You're safe now," one of them said, his voice kind but urgent. Claire let them hold her. She felt strong hands supporting her, calming voices surrounding her like a warm blanket. For the first time in days, she didn't have to fight alone. When she looked back at the vast forest, she saw only shadows dancing under the midday light. No sign of the bear, no threatening sound. Only the certainty etched into her skin and soul. She had faced the worst and survived. As the boat glided across the calm river waters, Claire closed her eyes. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning of a new life, one marked by pain, yes, but also by a strength she never knew she had. Months had passed since Claire had left the forest of Caribou Ridge behind. but the green, silent, brutal wilderness still lived in her dreams. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, the sounds of the bear and the breathing forest echoing in her mind. Other times, she caught the scent of wet earth and rotting wood, as if she'd never truly left that world where death had lurked in every shadow. The scars on her body told the story better than any words ever could. Thick, jagged lines crossed her forearm, permanent reminders of the claws that nearly took her. Smaller marks traced her legs and ribs, cuts, scrapes, cold burns from a survival won through sheer willpower. When Claire touched them, she didn't feel pain. She felt pride. She didn't hide those marks. To her, they were silent medals. Reminders of a battle fought not just against a wild bear, but against her deepest fears, against the hopelessness that had once tried to drown her. And strangely, they had become anchors, permanent proof that she was stronger than she'd ever believed. Claire rebuilt her life in a small cabin by a lake, far from noisy cities and shattered memories. There, in the solitude she now chose instead of feared, she found something she hadn't even known she was searching for: peace. Mornings began with steam rising off the water under the rising sun. Nights ended beneath a sky so vast and clear it seemed to swallow up all the pain of the past. Claire read, wrote in a battered notebook, worked the soil with her hands, and slowly she rebuilt the woman the forest had broken and also forged. One afternoon, while organizing things in the cabin, she found the small knife she'd lost in the forest. They had recovered it along with the rest of her belongings from the trail. The metal was rusted, the blade dull, but Claire smiled as she held it. You were reckless, she thought, almost laughing aloud, but you were brave. That same week, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would return to the forest, not to tempt fate again, not to prove anything to the world or even to herself, but to honor the fight, the life, the rebirth that had happened. There this time she wouldn't go unprepared. She wouldn't go unprepared. That same way to reach this clarity, she would return, not to tempt, not to prove anything to the world or even to herself, but to honor the fight, the life, the rebirth that had the foe choose, not to tempt the vid. She would study, the world, train, or even to herself, both body but to and honor mind. The fight. She would return not as a victim, but as part of the wilderness, understanding both its danger and its deadly beauty. That night, before bed, Claire walked to the edge of the lake. The water reflected the stars. She took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs, and finally felt something real, a peace earned by every scar, every tear, every fear overcome. She smiled at her reflection in the water, gently touching the longest scar on her arm. Thank you for not giving up on me, she thought silently. She knew one truth now, deep in her bones. The woman who had entered the forest would never return, and that was the best part.